All right. Good morning, everybody. We are live with this second experiment of the same kind as the first. This is a Shape Up live stream. We tried one of these a few weeks ago with Adam Wathan, and today we have Pablo Pinto here. Thanks, Pablo, for joining us. Nice to have you.
Thank you, Ryan. It's very looking forward to this session. So glad you're making time for all of the Shape Up practitioners to actually join this conversations.
Sure thing, yeah. And the basic format here is that we'll talk a little bit about kind of your background and how you got to Shape Up, and also like what your team is doing and how you're structured, and we'll just sort of learn a little bit about your context, and then we'll get into any questions that you have and see what there is to talk about. So maybe just I guess we'll just start at the obvious point. How did you actually, no, let's do this first. Can you tell me a little bit about sort of where are you working? What does the firm do? Like, what do you make? That kind of a thing.
Sure thing. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I'm Pablo. I'm the product manager here at G2I. G2I is a specialized marketplace for developers. So what we do is we place developers with jobs, and we call it a specialized because we focused specifically in 3 technologies right now, which are React Native, and Node. And so we operate mostly as a services company. So we're high touch sales, very human-led approach to doing the placement. And we've slowly started to tinker with some products that we want our both sides of our marketplace to use. And that's where we are now in terms of product development. So we're still a services company mainly, and we're trying to again experiment and shift a little bit to more product-led growth, because that's kind of that's how we're going to be able to scale, right? If we have product market fit doing what we do, and we want to scale, we need to do something more in terms of product-led.
So I want to ask you some stupid questions about this. So like who's your customer? Is it the business that's hiring the person? Is it both? Are they like who pays you, and how does the business work?
So yeah, that's a good question, because I know marketplaces are different types of models. So for us we see customers being on both sides. We care deeply about the developer experience, right? So the developer is it's one of the stakeholders or supply that we really care for and want to do well by them. Obviously we don't charge them, we pay them.
Right.
Well, we charge the client on the other side of the marketplace. And for the same way it goes with the client. We want them to have the best experience as possible. And what we've seen in our industry is that there's a lot of information asymmetry. Typically the client and developer, they don't always know what they want from each other. They don't always know who they're getting. But our goal here is to actually, and that's one of our big differentiators with other marketplaces, is that we're building a very transparent experience for both sides. Things like client being able to see the code challenge that we sent to a developer, or being able to watch the technical interview of the developer. Those are things that you don't really see in our industry, and that's kind of what we're aiming for. Yeah.
And what is the what's the high touch aspect of the experience that you're trying to? So you sort of talked about this effort to productize. Like what is the before world look like that's like very high touch and not productized?
So if you think about it from the opposite perspective, it might be easier to understand. There are so many marketplaces where you don't talk to anybody and you get what you want, right? You can think of Turo or Airbnb, instant booking, or any of the other marketplaces. Whereas we typically take days to weeks to actually onboard a developer. Things like understanding
to onboard the developer. Okay.
Yeah. So we want to, because we want to vet. Vetting technically is not the longest part of the process, but vetting them for a remote culture is sometimes what takes time. And we learned that our clients, a good fit of a developer and a client, and a good experience for both the client and the developer is going to be to have developers in our ecosystem that are, not just technical savvy, but they're also able to adapt to remote first, async, high growth companies. So that's where this high sales or high touch sales comes in, because our growth team who works with the clients are making sure that the client understands what they're getting from the
I see.
developer side.
Yeah. I see. Okay. And where are you at in terms of like how long ago did you join, and in what role, and kind of what's your team look like?
Yeah, I mean that's going to be good for context and to segue into how we ended up with ShapeUp, because I mean I joined the company the beginning of the year, and I joined the company as their first product manager. And to me, it was when I joined, it was literally the typical product pod in software in the software industry, right? So we had lead engineer, head of design, 5 engineers between our back end and front end. And I came in. I was literally the 8th person, and that was our product pod.
And what? Okay, so it's like what? So when you came in as a product manager, okay, so you said there was a lead engineer, a head of design, and five engineers.
Yep.
And when you came in as head of product, like what was your job supposed to be? Like why you know what I mean? Like why were they bringing a head of product in? Like what were you supposed to do?
Well, it's interesting because the background of that was that many people in the company were doing the managing of the product, right? So it turns out that after being in this, I guess, larger team dynamics, and with the roadmap ahead of the team for 2020, it seemed reasonable for them to go out and hire somebody who could take care of that. So it was a little bit of a mix of project management and product management.
Yeah. Okay.
Because otherwise we would have our CTO or our lead engineer doing this kind of activities and and leading the agile methodology that we were in, but they were also at the same time had other tasks like that. You don't want to have a CTO involved deeply in your
I see.
Different.
Yeah. And was there like, did they kind of have like a big I mean, you mentioned roadmap, but I'm not always sure what that means. Like, did they have kind of a big vision of like what they were trying to accomplish? Like, there's all this stuff that we intend to do, and like, how are we going to get all this stuff done? Like, okay, let's bring somebody in to like make this stuff happen.
Yeah, I mean, there was, and there to a certain degree still is, because things have changed a lot since ShapeUp, since May. But just to give you a little bit of more context, what the dynamic was in our team when I joined was essentially a ticket factory for development, and then in a different tool there was a roadmap of what management wanted to happen, and then there's a disconnect in the middle, because you have management pushing for some things, and then you have the disconnect typically is what I saw was that the engineers weren't always buying into what we needed to build. And some of the initiatives were not really properly discussed, like we are doing now. So things were just, hey, we want to do this, and then we have, think about one of the things that we shipped, right? We've been wanting to have a user-facing portal for jobs, like a job portal, like where a developer goes in and applies. That was, let's say, it was created with like some sort of like management mandate, so to speak, right? And the developers back then 6 months ago would have had to somebody would have had to estimate how long it was going to take, and what kind of experts we needed, and set up the boards and set up the whole 9 yards of agile, which we used to have. But that we saw that I wasn't around, but from what I hear in the conversations was that 2019 was the year where a lot of this disconnect happened, where there was no real way for the engineers to be part of this process of understanding what they were building. So they're too far disconnected from the goal of the company. So when I some of the things that I noticed when I came in was that's literally what was happening. A developer is only looking at 2 weeks ahead of himself, whereas as a product manager, I get to see a little bit further out, and I wanted the input of the engineer earlier, right? I want them to understand that even if it's a bug fix, how important that bug fix is to meeting our management goals. So there's a disconnect between, let's say, the business side, who they're executing and they have, sales goals, and the engineering team, which they don't always know what's going on the other side of the company.
Okay, so this is a stupid question, but like, why did it matter to you that that the engineer like understood better, kind of like why, how important it was to build this thing, or like what management wanted out of it? Like why did it matter to change that?
I mean, so personally, my experience in product for for the last few years has been working directly with engineers. My past two jobs were places that we dealt with engineers as our main stakeholder.
Mm,
And so I come from a background of having an engineer always in the roundtable, right?
mm,
And starting at a company and seeing these things kind of led me to think, okay, where's the input from the engineer? Because engineers have a very unique way of solving problems.
mm,
And a lot of the times, we're hard engineers and saying like they're developing things that only engineers understand. Like if you think about how software was developed 30 years ago, that was true.
mm-hmm,
But
mm-hmm.
today you have the opportunity to have that same logic and computational thinking to solve a problem, while also having somebody like, let's say myself, at the table that's pushing for a UX alternative to the solution, or something more user friendly to the solution. So
Uh-huh.
by having more people and more perspectives, you're definitely able to see better results. So
I
results
see.
are aligned more with the end user.
I
That's how I
see.
see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. And
Um,
actually, I wanted to jump to one quick question I forgot to
yeah.
ask earlier, which was sort of where are you coming from in terms of your background? Like how did you get into the PM role, and like what skills did you build up in the past that like you now kind of bring to bear?
Yeah. So I have I don't have a what I would say a defined or characteristic product manager approach to get into product management.
Uh-huh.
It's a it's
This
a
seems to be a trend, though. I always feel like this is a weird
it's
question to ask. Like, how did you get into this role? Because it's
yeah.
always this like in between role, you know?
Yeah, no, totally. And I think it's because of I mean, if you just looking at some of the history of product management, it all really came from, developers who were sunsetting their developing careers, and they're kind of helping the business because they understood what it took to build, in terms of technical savviness. I think today you're right. I do see, like, I'm not the only person who got into product by not being a developer.
Hmm.
There's tons of people out there in the same camp as I am. I mean, I guess I suppose my tech career started, as a founder of a company back in 2012.
Hmm.
It was really the first experience, and I'm no CS degree major. I'm an economics major. I've been always looking at the front side of the business, and it's
Uh-huh.
been some sort of an evolution from being understanding sales operations to learning product. And really in 2015, I joined an ad tech company up in Boston, and it's when I really saw and understood how there's an entire world behind the screen, and how that's
Mm.
adding value to every single industry, right? Like what Mark Andreessen says about software in the world is something that I wouldn't understand 7 years ago, is something that
Mm.
I see today as like probably an understatement, right? Because of the
Mm. Hmm.
power of software development. So I wanted to stay in that field, and like I said, because of the nature of the companies where I was at, where I've been in the past 5 years,
Hmm.
including G2I, it's a role where you have to understand what developers want, like what developers do, what they're looking for. How do you help them? How do you help that experience for them?
Hmm.
So even though I cannot really code beyond HTML and CSS.
Hmm.
I understand what they're feeling and what they're doing, and so it seemed like a good fit for me to continue in this industry where I'm still learning a lot of the technical part of the business, but because I've already have experience in the other side, I kind of become a good bridge of relaying the information between business and back end, and then back end or developer team or engineering team to the business, to the front end of the
I see.
business.
I see.
Yeah.
And when was it that you came into G2I then?
January.
January. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So you joined in January. Like what's happening then when you come on board?
So this is what I was talking to you about. Like, we have the perfect product pod. So I'm super excited about doing this. The project that they had started back, December, so a month before I joined, was our website. So it was a website redo. Designs were ready, sort of ready. And I came in and I was literally put into managing the ticket factory. Like we had project management tool, all the tickets are in there, and we're kind of just scoping. We're working in this methodology where you know what you want to ship, and you have some sort of estimate, right? So I think we gave us some between 8 to 12 weeks to do it, and we started struggling with that dynamic, right? We had management a little bit frustrated that things are not being shipped when we were when we promised to ship. The engineering team at the same time would be sometimes frustrated that for instance, some designs were missing or something specific about a page wasn't really scoped, like the little details, right? That usually engineers will be able to pick up and say, hey, nobody thought about the connection of, let's say, this job board to or what happens when somebody enters an email here in this careers page, like where does it go? Like nobody thought of that. And so we kind of struggled that way, and that's why I think ShapeUp really became so important for us, and it has become such a turning point, because to start with, it was that for us to get into ShapeUp was that rare opportunity where top down meets bottom up, so to speak. You had, because I remember when I joined the company, our founder and CEO Gabe, he said to me, hey, there's this podcast, there's a new concept, and there's a book, and there's this thing about fixed time variable scope. Check it out, maybe it helps us. But we were so deep into shipping the website, there was no way that I could go out and explore without this new thing, right? So I had to wait a little bit until we shipped the website. We had, we appeased the growth team, and now we could go out and explore. And that's literally what happened. At some point, I had already, listened to a couple of your podcasts, had read the book, and the same week was, I believe, somewhere in April, where our CEO and CTO had said, "Hey, I'm also reading the book." Now the three of us we're aligned. So now now the management team is aligned with the product team, and we're saying, we now have the same mindset, the same framework, that we can, is it time to switch? Yes, it is. And there were so many doubts that we had at that point, but we just knew that what we had wasn't working, right? So at that point, you really have nothing to lose. So it just became a no-brainer to adopt a new methodology. And to be frank, from my experience in product, is that we haven't really seen any sort of evolution. I mean, we've seen the small evolution from, like, say, Agile in the last 15, 20 years since it's been around. But you go from from a waterfall paradigm to Agile, it's such a big shift, right? And then you have an entire industry shifting. Yet that it's like a tectonic change. That's how big the change was back then. And what I feel today is that there hasn't been anything similar to go from Agile to something else. And it's not like Agile is, it's the best thing we've seen. So many people and so many companies struggle with it, yet there's no new way. And I wonder, and sometimes I think out loud, I wonder if ShapeUp is going to be a small innovation or evolution, or is it going to be like that tectonic shift? Are we going to be able to change things so dramatically that's going to be the de facto methodology?
So it sounds kind of like other options on the table. It was like what you had wasn't working, and then here at least some different idea. It wasn't like, let's go shopping on the marketplace of methodologies. No. It was more like, oh, maybe there's something else.
And that was literally it. Yeah, it was like, we're struggling with what we have. There's really very few options that we can use to adopt the new methodology. There's this one. Let's try it out. We obviously, again, like I said, we had a lot of questions. We didn't know where, it seemed to work for Basecamp. So great. We admire Basecamp and the founders and yourself, and we've followed your work. So it also made sense. It's a company that we.
Did you have any sense of, when you were kind of having these early conversations before you actually made the jump and started to implement it, what was going to be different? Do you know what I mean? What did you think was going to change?
I mean, I think the first thing that came to my mind at that point was the team. It's hard to impose something to a team, especially when it's like a framework of working. I think that was our biggest, I wouldn't say hesitation, but the biggest thing that we had in mind was because these were people that were here before me, and by no means I would take credit for saying like I came in and implemented this. Like I said, it was more of a tops down meets bottom up, and
Right.
we loved the people that we had in our team. Like back then we had, again, 8 people, and today that same 8 people is 3 people. And so we knew that this could be potentially too much of a radical change for some, and then we decided that was okay with us. I have the spirit of building a company for the ages, not for the people who are around. We want to do well by the people and by our teammates as much as we can, but people come and go, and companies usually stay. And so we knew this was the right thing for the company. And so how do we do some of the damage control, when the time came of having to talk to people, or people actually just leaving the company, which is, I think, what happened in our product team. So that was the first thing. But then the other bigger, big umbrella of what I thought would be a bigger change was, the shaping part, right? Because a lot of the times we came into a, sub-optimized version of a scope, let's say, and we kind of had to figure things out on the go as they were building something. We were all too deep into if you think about it, how engineers think about their task switching costs. In a way, for us, is kind of, I think a similar analogy would be the cost of switching from being deep in the weeds of a ticket factory and then thinking, in a bigger perspective, like thinking about the yearly goals, right? And we needed that. We needed something, or a tool, or people, or a methodology that would help us see the forest beyond the trees, because we have. Yeah, we have.
Like,
so
how do you move up and down the different levels of scale of like, what are we doing right now versus what are the bigger things that we're trying to do?
Yeah, in a way, because now how we look at that right now is, in 6-week chunks, or 8-week chunks, because that's how long the cycles are. But we are now, back then you had, okay, initiative A, and this is what we want, and this is when I want it, and that was kind of it. Now we have initiative A, maybe in a smaller version, like less, less developed, or just say like 1 feature instead of 10 features, but it's going to happen because it's bounded to 6 weeks. And that's literally what happened. Like, our biggest win was shipping this developer portal, which had been scoped for months, like even before I came to the company. And the only time we got it shipped was in our first cycle. Like, that's how the dramatic change of being able to scale up and down the product when we have a constraint of time has helped us tremendously.
Awesome. So what's so you've got like kind of the one designer. Used to have. Okay, so like, what's the makeup of the team look like today?
So the team right now is lead engineer, junior engineer, and myself. Like, that's the product team, and our CTO is helping a lot right now because of the transition. But that's kind of one of the things that that I wanted to talk to you about today. Was I kind of wrote my feedback in in 3 sort of aspects or themes, right? Questions, adaptations or experiments, and some wins. That hopefully, if I have time to share, I'll share them with everybody. But when it comes to the experiments and the adaptation, if you think about how ShapeUp or the book really is saying, hey, like, you have a team, so here's what you do. For us, it's like, hey, we have no team. Well, right now we're trying to go down to really become very nimble, so that we can, whenever we need developers, we have our own marketplace, right? Like, we're actually going to start using our own product. Like, we're going to eat our dog food. We're going to go out there and hire the developers that we need, and so that's going to happen every 8 weeks. And so that's something new, I think, that we're doing, that we're adapting to our reality. Is we have a very small team. And it became smaller after the second cycle. So the third cycle will happen in about a month. And that's going to be the first time where we see, okay, like, how are we're applying right now, obviously, like, one of the pitches for this current cycle was, let's make our tech infrastructure, let's design it in a way that it's kind of built as an open source project, so that we can augment the team and then tone it down depending on what we have, on our needs for development.
Hmm.
So
I,
it's a work in progress. It's not really like we haven't
yeah.
really, I'll have to come back to you in 6 months and tell you like how we're doing with
Yeah,
with this.
yeah. So then, in terms of sort of the front end or the design, like user interface and stuff like that, is this kind of just like falling on the two engineers that you have, or is this something that you're doing, or how's that happening?
The first time that we had this, we had to hire a contractor. So we hired a very senior designer for 2 weeks, and
Uh-huh.
and so we placed them in the first 2 weeks of the build cycle.
Okay.
It's something that we kind of wanted to also, kind of
That's what
throw
I
it
was
out
kind of
there.
curious about.
And
Yeah. Uh-huh.
yeah, I mean, we didn't know at that point. It was really more about our a time crunch. It's like, hey, the cycle begins this date. We have about a 5 week or 5 days to hire a designer.
Yeah.
Our founder happens to be a designer himself, and so we're lucky in the way that he could filter out and say, hey, these are the 10 people that we want you to talk to
Mm.
if we ever hire a designer. So
Hmm.
vetting for quality is good. It's easy for us. Vetting
Hmm.
for let's say culture fit would take more time. So
Sure.
we had a good feeling about this designer who came in, and like I said, in terms of like logistics, he worked the first 2 weeks of the cycle. He was doing we have a design library, so to speak. So
Okay.
that I think made things easier for him. And he had to experiment, and we literally had daily feedback loops. And I
Hmm.
was the one that would handle or communicate some of the feedback to him in terms of you're going the right way or not.
Hmm.
And we did that within the project. So we had the two engineers that were working on the project. We had myself, and we also had the stakeholders, the people who had shaped or who had pitched that portal. So we also were
Uh-huh.
able to get their feedback. They knew that we couldn't take a while to get feedback because in 2 weeks this person was leaving,
Uh,
and that was it worked out really well. Like we got what we wanted out of this engagement. And so that was the only experiment that we've had in terms of having a contractor designer coming in for a cycle, and it worked well. That's how things stand today.
uh-huh. Okay. And when you were kind of doing things in the Ticket Factory style before, you had a designer on staff during those days?
Mhm. Yep, we did.
Okay. And okay, so I mean, like I'm curious. The world that you're describing right now is very different than my like kind of little perfect model universe of a shape up team of like, full-time designer and then programmer, and then like somebody shapes
Hmm.
it and gives it to the designer and the programmer. So I'm kind of curious how this plays out for you, but I don't exactly know what to ask about it. So what is it from your side that any questions you might have or things that we could talk about that are challenges right now?
Yeah, I mean that's great because the design is something, like I said, when we decided to put the designer into the first 2 weeks of the cycle, we thought, hey, is this the right thing to do, or do we want to run some sort of design sprint pre-cycle, right? Like, do we have to stay ahead of the curve, knowing that in
Right.
the next betting table, I have 2 or 3 pitches that include a designer that I don't have, and
Hmm.
that I'm responsible to get right. How I mean, is that something that, like I said, you haven't really seen this at Basecamp, obviously, but do comparing to what we did, do you think maybe having a design sprint or a designer before the build cycle starts would be a good thing or not?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I'm curious. When so this project that you hired the contractor designer for, this was a developer portal, you said?
Yeah, just your typical job portal, card looking, horizontal card looking jobs. You scroll, very little, functionality, small profile for the developer. Obviously a lot of backend stuff that you connect the portal to our internal facing platform that we have, which is kind of like an ATS looking system.
Uh,
Um,
s- what is an ATS looking system? What is that?
yeah, so sorry, I spent it. So the ATS meaning an applicant tracking system. So
Okay.
that system has.
Specific
Yeah,
jargon here.
I'm
Learning.
sorry. I know I'm the king of acronyms. I could use acronyms all day long, and it's really annoying. And I'm trying to use them less. So thank you for stopping me there. The application tracking system is basically the tool that you use for recruitment, like things like, you have sometimes you do have account creation, but
You as the person who is who's trying to hire a developer, or
so I mean this tool in general is what I'm talking about. Like if you go to if you go to hire.com, like that's they'll probably have an ATS in the back, which is you have somebody on the GUI like applying to a job, and then what happens behind the scenes is is let's say a hire.com rep who is moving this person around or putting this person into a client, which is kind of what happens with us, right? I'll use exactly our example, our platform. When somebody applies to become a G2I engineer, we see that that application, we kind of vet some of the things, and then we have some action buttons, and we say, okay, invite this person to the first assessment, invite this person to upload the challenge, onboard this person if he's veteran qualified, and so that platform.
And then this portal was more from the developer's side like more from the applicant's side.
Correct. Exactly. So if you wanted to apply for a job at G2I, once you were onboarded, we'll give you keys to go to the portal and apply the jobs yourself.
I see.
And so for you to see the job, it's going to be there's some work on this platform that we had to build so that you can see the job, different characteristics of the job, technologies, clients. So there was some backend work on this developer portal project. And that's what the developers started doing at the beginning, because obviously you don't want to have two, and I don't know if you were trying to go at this earlier, but what does the developer do if there are no designs for 2 weeks? It's kind of like what maybe you would think,
Yeah, well, so I wanted to understand a little bit of the context, and now I want to ask you about the going into this portal project. There was some shaping that happened. What did that shaped work actually look like? So what if we were looking at the pitch right now, what would we see?
So you would see a smaller version of what our ambition for a portal is, right? In terms of features, we literally or functionalities, thinking that we have a fixed time to ship this, we cut the scope. It's literally what we did, right?
And more concretely, are we looking at paragraphs of text? Are we seeing drawings?
Yeah, a little bit of both. I mean, this one specifically was, the person who shaped this one, for the most part, isn't himself an engineer. So there was a lot of, graphs about, and it was very low, low definition, sketches of here's what literally the horizontal card, company logo, company name, technology, days in the market, and that all goes in that's the main part of the of the scrolling experience of a endless scroll sort of functionality, with the user having limited very limited functionality. Literally we have the only I think must have for that project was to deliver the ability for a developer to apply for a job. Nothing else. No communication, no account creation, no editing of anything. Just that one thing is what,
and so it sounds like there was a sort of fat marker sketch level of detail about what more or less needs to be on the screen, and the project starts, and then when you bring you had this question about what are the developers do first, and do they need design first? So how did it play out in this particular project? You had the designer come in for the first 2 weeks. Were the developers waiting for completed designs before they started, or what was happening in that 2 weeks?
They definitely weren't waiting, but in retrospect, I could tell you that maybe it was a little bit lighter on the capacity that we assigned for that project. But if you think about functionality, there's really like one thing that this portal needs to achieve for the user. In terms of that team specifically was someone who's mainly backend and somebody who's mainly front end. For the backend developer, I think the experience would have been no different, because most of the things he had to do was, again, to think about what was in this internal looking ATS and what needed to communicate to this new thing. So putting together all these connections, which were also part of the shaping, it was there.
So for the back end, for the full back end, it was more or less clear like what to do from the beginning, because this was already like kind of implicit in the shaping doc.
It was more clear.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was more clear. For the front end, for the front end was a little more difficult, because you can't really do something unless your designs are fully given to you to do. But like I said, I think the experience with a designer was so good that even from the beginning, so things obviously changed throughout the 2 weeks. But even things like the grids or the color palettes or the components were things that we could have, that we had already, and that could have been, that was built already in the first few days of the project. And only when we finally got the final designs, I would say that was showtime, right, for this developer, for the front end developer.
I see.
And that's why maybe we were thinking, okay, maybe we did it right, or maybe we got lucky, but it worked out. But is there a better way? Do we need to have a designer before we start the developers?
Yeah,
because it's typically what happens. So
yeah, that's interesting. I mean, the way that we look at it is there's never any high fidelity design that kind of has to be fully finished, that goes over the wall to the programmers to get going. There's this sense that the shaped work is at the fat marker sketch level, and then when the project kicks off, the thing that you said about the back end, I think, is always true. There's always something that the back end can just start looking at immediately, because there's a lot of questions about what connects to what and what's the right modeling approach and stuff like that. But then concerning the front end, what'll usually happen is one of our designers. So things are a little bit different for us, because our designers are also front end and developers, in the sense that they kind of build their own views. But I think the process is the same, which is that the designers they're going to pick off like one particular piece of like a particular, either a component or like a piece of the screen that like kind of needs to get figured out first. And it's very much like patchwork. It's not like the entire screen has to be designed top to bottom. So for example, like we had a project maybe a year or two ago, where we were introducing this ability to hide and show things from clients in Basecamp. Like if you invited somebody as a client, then you could turn off an entire to-do list and they wouldn't be able to see it. But they could see everything else on the project. And in that case, the designer was responsible to put some kind of a toggle into the template, so that you could say, like, is this visible or not? But that toggle didn't need to be sort of the final style, and it didn't need to have the final language on it. It was more about like, there has to be some kind of an affordance there. Like, and is it a button? Is it a button that has like a pressed in state and a not pressed state? Is it like two radio buttons, like visible or not visible? Like, is it a checkbox? Like, what's the right sort of, what kind of component is this? And then as long as there's some component there, and the designer is basically if the designer can say like, look, this is the right place, this is where this belongs, and this is how it fits in, so that, when the mobile view changes, it'll also still show up on top, or whatever. They can put a very small amount of work in to say, like, to almost like plant the flag in the ground, like, this is where this thing goes. This is more or less the type of interaction it is. And then already with that, the programmer can start to wire that into controller and then connect that back to the model, and like he can make it do something when you click on it. But the designer might not yet be very satisfied with the colors or with the language around it. Like, what's the right wording that we should use, and how much do we have to
Right.
explain it? And so there's this kind of sense of like, what are the foundational sort of key pieces that the designer needs to put in place so that the programmers are kind of unblocked. But that work that the designer puts in isn't necessarily, here's the pixel perfect mockup and now go and implement it, you know?
Right.
So there's this sense of being able to kind of work in iterations of getting more and more polished.
Yes, yeah, and you can have the luxury because, like you said, the composition of your team and the designer approach to to how you guys build is different than what we have.
Yeah.
Because yeah, as I say, because the alternative for us would be to have a designer working ahead of the cycle, ahead of the build cycle. But if there's no communication, like somebody
No,
would
I
have to
don't
bridge
think
the community.
it
Yeah,
wouldn't work to have them ahead of the cycle, because there are going to be things that just need to get solved with a collaboration between the designers and
correct.
the programmers, and you're not going to know as a designer if it's the right thing until you kind of see it in place, you know, like
Yeah.
you kind of put it into place and the programmer starts to connect it and you're like, oh, actually that's not quite right, like we should move it over here. I do think that I think that there is a gray area between giving a completely finished design over versus going in and just sort of stubbing out that radio button. If we look at it just kind of as a learning process, like I think part of what happens is sometimes we have like designers who are capable of making high fidelity design, but that doesn't mean that that they should always deliver high fidelity design. You know,
Right.
like it could actually be that the designer could deliver to a separate front end developer, like, hey, like I don't know the details yet, but I do know that I think it should be a radio button. So let's put a radio button here in the corner, and like
Right.
let's just do a round of development where we implement that radio button, and then I'll come back and give you a kind of update on what a better version of that looks like. But that way there's a learning process that's taking place, rather than, I think the thing that makes me a little bit nervous when I heard you describe the process is I always get nervous when I imagine that there's a designer somewhere who is kind of like master planning everything in their head, and then they're going to give you the perfect CAD drawing, and then you just have to go implement that. Every time we get into that situation, I get nervous because I feel like
Yeah.
there's going to be a collision between what the designer imagined was the right thing and what the reality proves out to be actually the right thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No,
So it's
I
always a
totally
question of
agree.
how do we how do we stage how do we introduce phases to that process so that the designer is getting feedback and not just
Mhm.
dictating the thing kind of wholesale, you know?
Yeah, so maybe, as you were explaining that, what I was thinking in my mind was I'm maybe trying to find a format, or I'm maybe trying to encapsulate this workflow of our, the designer in our team composition into a box that I can just say, here's the box, here's what it looks like, and this is how you do it. Where maybe that's going to be very hard and not impossible to do, because every time there's a new feature or product, things change, right? Like that, the context will be
Yes.
different every time. So
Yes.
it's like we're gonna have to do the work every single time to make sure that, for instance, what I could see happening now that that we're talking a lot about this is in some cases we can do what we did, designer for the first 2 weeks if things are kind of clear.
Mhm.
If things are unclear and we foresee, well, we need to give the designer time to do things on their own and then implement it with us, is maybe they start earlier and then they come to us and stay for 2 weeks or a little longer. So I think there's still, yeah, like maybe the answer is there's no right way to do it. It's like it's going to change
Yeah.
every single time.
Well, and I agree that there's no right. It's not like that there's no guidance at all. I think there is so I think one of the key things to maybe think about here is, so when I think about what our teams are doing, um, the key thing is that we know that we need interface design, right? And we need interface design, we need styling, we need front end implementation, and we need back end, right? These like four layers we need. The
Mhm.
thing that we cannot so we can predict that we need those things. The thing that we cannot predict in advance is the sequence of the problem solving. And the idea that designing and building has to happen in a sequence, not a predetermined sequence, like first we design and then we build and then we test. No, the sequence is actually what is the right sequence of the work. So like in this particular project, should we first design the job card, or should we first design the flow for accepting the job or submitting it, or I don't know what the pieces were, but there were different pieces. So I almost think of it as like patches. There's different patches of the problem. And then what the team actually kind of figures out together, and this is the thing that you don't know in advance, is what is the right order of problems to solve. And then if you pick one little problem, then what you want to have is like just enough design to unblock the programmer for that. And then the programmer can wire something. And then you can improve the styling once you're confident that it's the right thing. So you kind of go in with this sense of like, we don't know where to start. We don't know what the right order is, but we do know like that I'm the one that can do the design and you're the one that can build it. So let's pick a small piece, and then I'll give you just enough design to do that. You'll build it just far enough for us to look at it. And then we'll look at it on a staging server and see like, are we making progress or not? Okay, this looks right. Just like if you were, like you're building a shed, like in the backyard, like first you have to figure out sort of like, is it the right place or not? And then you stand it up
Yeah.
and it's like, okay, now we'll paint it, right? But you don't necessarily need the paint color when you aren't sure what the dimensions should be. And so what I could imagine actually is like rather than having a 2-week commitment at the beginning, it might be more fitting to this process that I don't know if I'm describing it clearly, but it might be more fitting to this process to have a certain number of hours on retainer over the course of the 6 weeks. And that what you want to be able to do is say like, whenever we need to unblock ourselves by learning what to do next with a little bit of design, we basically need to grab 4 hours of design now. And this 4 hours of design is going to be, we're not going to know which problem it's for because the sequence of the work is very project specific. But as a team, we're going to say, this is the thing we need to know next. Can you go and design this one piece and then get 4 hours of design? And then maybe 4 days go by, right? Of implementing that one piece, learning if it's the right thing, and then choosing the next piece that you need design for.
Yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense. Like it's awesome. Thank you for making us think it differently, because honestly, we were seeing things a little more serially when they're maybe not.
So
And
they,
I
they are they are cereal, but they're cereal in little
in
little
the
packages. So it's
yeah.
like you have a little package of like front of like mock it up and then front end design and then connect it to the back end and then test. Like it's true that you have that, but you don't have it as one block for the entire project. It's like a fractal. You have it as like for like individual scopes.
That's awesome. Yeah, that makes sense. And it's funny because that reminds me of another thing that I had written down in terms of like the challenges. So this is one, right? The design aspect,
Mhm.
and then the other one was, which I guess it could be applied to the same concept, but the idea of like how do you see, like for instance, the betting table is one thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of this analogy.
Yeah.
Sometimes I see the betting table as the train that leaves the station and just goes. And I think there's an opportunity to maybe shift that thinking to, instead of a linear dynamic of the betting table being more circular in a way, or maybe more of a loop, where yes, the train goes, right? Like you've bet on your projects, you started, but there's an opportunity eventually to catch the train again at the main station. Meaning, would you at some point alter something that's already in the works, or even potentially shape something new? So if you were to if you were to bet on, let's say, 5 projects, but then in the first 2 weeks of the building cycle, you have a new idea. Like, how do you catch the train again when it comes
I
back? And
see.
you say, hey, we have a 6th project actually, and this has become recent for us because we kind of hit a point where we needed to fix something, and it wasn't a bug. It was like a business problem, and we kind of started shaping something in the middle of a cycle, and we've got so much input from different places, from different teams, a lot of poking holes, external consultants, and I feel like we have now a pitch, right? And like, it's not we can't wait, for the next trip. Like, we have to catch the train again. Like, how do you see that kind of coming back to?
That's interesting. Yeah. So, okay, the first thing that I would say is, at the end of the day, the business is more important than the methodology. So, if you really are in some kind of a crisis, it's a genuine crisis. Like, something is broken badly and it needs to be fixed immediately. It's a real, genuine, honest problem. Then of course you can throw any process out and you can interrupt the bet and you can just do something different, right? That's always all right. Of course,
Right.
if that happens, if that should only happen very rarely, and if it happens more regularly, then it indicates that there's a deeper problem, of course. When it comes to sort of revising the bets or changing the bets or something like that, this doesn't work because the thing that the bet does is it's not only about setting the direction of, like, this is what we intend to do over the next, let's say, 6 weeks. And I'm just going to use for the moment, let's just use the example of a proper, like, 6-week project, as opposed to a bet that's made of a number of smaller projects, because that's something that we can talk about as being slightly different. But to be principled, let's just use the example of a single 6-week project. The fact that the outer frame of the bet is frozen completely, and it's not possible to change the amount of this, that it's 6 weeks, that this is what was shaped, this is the overall scope of what was shaped. The fact that that is frozen is the hard outer wall that allows the teams to actually make decisions and trade-offs inside of that time. If they don't have a fixed wall around them, then they don't have any reference points to say, like, what should I do first, and then what are we going to do next week? And okay, now we're starting to run out of time, so we have to adjust our plan. Like, those fixed walls are the things that push on the team to motivate them to collaborate and make trade-offs. If you feel like at any given moment the plan could change, then you as a contributor can't kind of create your own plans, about what am I doing today versus tomorrow, and how do we make these trade-offs. So it's very important. The thing that I didn't write about this in the book, but the thing is that the one of the key kind of deeper ideas of shape up is that you have a hard wall and a soft middle. Very often what happens in the ticket world is you have a very hard definition of the inside of the work. Every little piece of work is very defined as a ticket, and so you're always doing very well-defined tasks, but the outer wall of the overall time for the project and when it ships is fuzzy. It keeps getting pushed out and out and out and delayed because you are trying to specify all the details on the inside. So then what happens is, like, there's this trade-off. If you try and specify all the details inside, the outer wall just keeps getting pushed out, and it's very hard to predict the actual ship date. Versus if you fix the outer wall and make that hard, but you don't commit to any details. This is a principle of fixed time variable scope.
Correct. Yeah.
The soft middle gets filled in with all kinds of spontaneous decision making based on the facts on the ground, right? This outer wall thing only works if you actually enforce it, and this also kind of goes to the notion of the circuit breaker. Like, if you don't finish the project, it's going to get canceled at the end of the 6 weeks. Like, you actually have to make the trade-offs to succeed. So from a very principled point of view, I think that it's very important to honor the bets in order for them to sort of serve this function. Now, if your 6 week cycle is more of a small batch cycle, and you're filling the 6 weeks with a handful of projects that are more or less meant to be, 2 weeks in scope, where that like with about roughly 2 weeks of time inside of the 6 week cycle, that they should be able to finish this sort of smaller project that was defined. It's not the worst thing to observe that the team still has 2 weeks left, and then they didn't start the last thing that was in the bet, and you had a better idea, and you say, hey, you know what? Let's sort of forget that and let's do this other thing instead. If it's well shaped, if it's genuinely well shaped and it's just as well shaped as the other thing, and they didn't start the other thing yet, and I don't think it's a terrible thing to make a substitute there. But in general, the thing is that, it would be better to really commit to all of that during the cool down time, because sometimes when you make a quick decision to swap out some work, it's just very easy to tell yourself like, oh, it'll be no problem, we'll just swap that in. And very often there are like subtleties that are easy to miss, versus if you actually take that time and think it through during cool down. For example, we might give a team 4 projects to do that are small batch projects inside of a 6 week cycle. Depending on the work that we give them, the team might actually choose to do one of them earlier in the cycle than the other, because it has more unknowns, or because it's more stressful, and it's not very good for the team to kind of drop something unexpected into them, because they were probably kind of arranging their sequence. Again, sequence is very important, of which project they were doing in what order, depending on their, like, how do I, like, work isn't just work. Like, if you have to do 10 things today, you don't just pick the 10 easiest things, and you don't just pick the 10 hardest things. You do like something hard in the morning, and then you do something easy before lunch, and then you take lunch, and then you do something hard again, and then you do something easy at the end of the day, because there's this like rhythm, you know what I mean, of like how you use your energy to be productive. And this is also true inside of the 6 week cycle, that the teams need to actually kind of be able to say, okay, we'll do this one first, and then I'll be ready for the next one. And there's kind of this wave, and if you're swapping stuff in and out of the team, it's hard for them to learn their own rhythms and make their own judgments about kind of what work they do when.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I like this idea of principle, right? Like this is the principle. And of course, like, when stuff hits the fan, principles go away, it's fine. But for the most part, it's, you want to stick to that. And there's like maybe like another, I think, deeper or, a structural thing that we're kind of struggling with. And there's one thing that, and maybe I should give you a little bit of context. And I hope we have maybe a little, if we can go over a few minutes, because it might take another 5
this is fine.
Or so. That's cool.
Fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the context for this next challenge, which I want to tie back to this being principled idea, is, we're using, for the first cycle, we used our, we did shape up only for our product team. And for the second cycle, which is currently happening, we open it up to all the teams, 5 teams in the company. 5
interesting.
Functional teams, yeah.
Uh-huh.
And it's been, a surprisingly good opportunity for team leads to actually be part of the shaping. So they're also shaping their ideas, and of course they have other different dynamics and teammates and yada yada.
Yeah.
And I can go into a lot of different questions about that, but I'm not really sure that's appropriate for the forum, because people here are talking about mostly developing products. But that is the context, right? And so we kind of have our guardrails in the company as to dates when we want things, right? So obviously, date for the beginning of the cycle, date for the end of the cycle, but we also put dates, which I maybe call them soft dates, but this is when we have actually a hard date, because the betting table takes place on the first Tuesday of the cool down. Like that's what it's been sort of set in stone, and then we have reasoning why, or we think we have reason for that. And then the softer deadlines are the things that I think we're struggling with. How and one of the things that we're trying to avoid is this time crunch where we say, okay, it's week 6 of the build cycle. We're gonna have a betting table next week, and then all of a sudden, whereas we had 5 different pitches, now we have 15, right? And so within 5 days, 10 new pitches surfaced from different parts of the company, right? So I wonder if there's any way to, again, tying back to the idea of principle, like just how you put that, or just how you explain the outer wall and the fixed time the fixed time for development teams. Is there any way that you would think would be fair, right? Like not something that has to be like imposed in a bad way, but a way to help the teams shape in a certain time frames, because there really isn't a lot of like between week 1 and week 6, unless your work ethos is one where that putting a little bit of time every week is better than cram it on week 6. There's really no rule internally for, hey, we have this new pitch, and now we have only days left to sort of review.
That's a good question. That's very interesting. So if I understand right, the question is about is it just about how much time you allow to review the pitches, or is it also about the time for creating pitches, or the quantity of pitches, or where's the question in that?
It's really both, and to make it even more complex, it's even more about who is how do we get more team leads involved in the shaping, right? And again, sorry that I'm kind of veering away from product development.
I think this is an excellent. This is very relevant. I actually think my instinct is to go the other way and not say how can we get more team leads involved in shaping. Actually, my instinct is to say how can we narrow the responsibility of shaping to somebody who is responsible for that, and then how can this person gather more, have more input and more feedback and more exchange with more people. Those are very different things. There's a difference between 10 people all writing pitches, and then they go into a pile, and then the betting table goes through this pile, versus one person writing. It doesn't have to be one person, but I'm being extreme. One person writing pitches, but that one person feels that in order for them to make the best pitch, that they need to really be informed and talk to more people in the company. It's a very different dynamic, right? And the main difference, I think, comes back to how walls force us to make trade-offs. So, for example, let's just say that there should only be really 3 pitches at the betting table. Let's just make up a number. If there could only be 3 pitches at the betting table for the product team to go build, then it would mean that there would actually more decision making happening in the crafting of the pitches than there would be otherwise. So this is a very productive constraint, because it means, look, if you only get to suggest 3 ideas, they better be your best ideas. And not only the best ideas, because what does the best ideas mean? I think it really invites us to ask ourselves, what are the most strategically important ideas? So I'm telling you, like right now, I'm working on Basecamp 4, which we intend to start building in 2021. And I have an idea that I'm very attached to, that I have been thinking about for like 2 years, that I finally got into a good shape, and I could give it to a team and we could do it. I'm totally attached to this idea. And I was very much intending for this to go into BC4. It has to do with how you specify who's involved in a project and what way they're involved. And then I did some interviews a week ago, and I suddenly got all these ideas related to to-dos that to me feel even more relevant to kind of more customers. And I think that they're going to unlock a lot more, they're going to help a lot more people to like deal with their daily work better. And I'm saying to myself, oh man, like I think I'm gonna have to throw out these people
Your
ideas
baby.
that I have been dreaming about doing because the thing is like it's not an option for me to just double the size of the scope. I'm not going to pitch twice as many things. Uh, I'm going to be going to Jason and I'm going to be saying, these are the 3 or 4 most important things that I think we should probably be doing for BC4. And, maybe those other things maybe we'll be able to fill them in because some of the things that we do don't take as long as we think, or maybe we'll do them in subsequent cycles after the big launch of the first version of BC4. But the fact that I have to choose instead of just putting a bigger pile onto Jason and saying, "Hey, it's your decision. Like I'm going to give you 8 good ideas instead of 4 good ideas." It's much more constructive for me, I think, to have to choose. Do you know what I mean? Because it's forcing me to ask myself much harder questions
And what really is important.
about what's actually driving the business. Like what is actually going to make a bigger difference in our position in the marketplace, or in terms of retention, or what's going to make a bigger difference for when people onboard, whether or not Basecamp clicks in and becomes something that is sticky for the organization. Like I need to think more about what's really effective because of that constraint. I don't know if that. I feel like I went away from your question, but does it give you any kind of an
No,
input
yeah,
to the question?
you did, but you stayed too because like I think that what I take away is if we look at it from, or if I look at this from the perspective of which I do, of like how do we help them, not how do they help us. It's like
Yeah.
different. Like how you're saying, you need to bring to Jason solutions, not problems. Like bringing them
Yes.
too much, right? Like that's our job, and
Yes.
like I see it the same way. Like I have the mentality of the product team being the butler of the company, and that's how I see it. That's how I like it. Like we're here to help, and specifically the product team. But now that my role has shifted a little bit to helping other teams, the question has really that spirit. It's not the spirit of like how do I enforce something, but like how do I empower them, or how do I help them, and how do I get them to see
Yeah.
where we need to go as a company, like where we need to
Yeah.
invest the time. So
I see a question that just came up in the chat here. Benjamin asks, is there a specific role who's responsible for shaping? And normally we don't do questions from the chat in this format. It's more about our conversation, but I thought this was relevant to what we were just talking about.
yeah.
Because I think what can easily happen is when we look at a process like ShapeUp, we can think that the pitch is a thing that needs to get written, and it's a kind of mechanical step in a methodology. Like as long as a pitch gets written, we can proceed. And I think it's really important to look at the writing and the shaping of the pitch not as like an artifact that has to exist, but as a process that needs to get carved out in the organization. Where does shaping happen? Who does the shaping? What inputs do they take? And then the pitch is just an output from this process, And I think
Right.
that this is actually a process that the organization goes through. This is what I'm seeing actually in a lot of companies. They start to realize that shaping is important. And then they go through a process that doesn't happen overnight. It takes some time of kind of figuring out like who is actually in the right position to, to, to who is the right person in the right position with the right skills and the right inputs, that as an organization, we're going to actually carve time around that person so we can kind of leave that person alone to do that work.
Yeah.
And
No,
sometimes it's like a senior designer who was always a little bit dissatisfied doing the visual stuff, and they always wanted to be a little bit more strategic. And then it's like you elevate them into the shaping role. Sometimes it's a PM who comes from a more business background, but they have a little bit of a UX sensibility, and they're actually pretty good at sketching together an idea. Sometimes it's a founder kind of retains that role because they have a very clear vision of where they want things to go. So to answer the question, like who does the shaping is not a fixed thing. It's a question of the relationships and the skills and the inputs and outputs of the people and in the organization. So I think this is a learning process, but I do think it's good to have an intention to kind of centralize this process, because if it gets a little bit more centralized into a defined person or a couple people, then everyone else in the organization will know who to go to when they have an idea. Do you know what I mean? And like when a project goes wrong and there's an issue in the shaping, that feedback can loop back into a specific place in the organization, so the learning happens. You know what I mean? So I think there's a lot of good effects that come from trying to kind of condense this role.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think even more so, when we're talking about different, teams doing shaping, because if you think about let's take the Basecamp example, which we know from reading the book, is that this is being used in the product team. You've been there for so long that you understand what the business is about. You understand the technical side because you've been there. And so it only makes sense that, now that you're in a strategy role, you're the person who's shaping. And that's not going to apply to all companies or all teams within companies. So for instance, it just, maybe it helps, give more details into the answer. What we've done is, like I said, like the fact that it's a learning process is spot on, because, for us, it's been only 2 cycles. So, we don't really know. We don't want to put guardrails or limit the creative thinking to just one person or 2 people,
Yes.
because that really it will be in detriment of the company. Like there's
Yes.
no one person, there's no one hero that can actually take on the entire shaping, or deciding what's going to be pitched or not. Like at least not for us. And so we have a structure where we have 6 teams, and it's like 3 teams. And above the, you have CEO on one side and CTO on one side. So we've kind of had these ideas in our heads of like, we have the playing with, right? Like we have a pre-bidding table. So pre-bidding table means this shaping happens within teams. Like none of us have to see what happens in the growth team until this thing is actually on the company bidding table. And then we get to see it. It is one way of approaching it. And then the other way of approaching it is kind of like incubating things a little more. Because if you start shaping something and you put it out there for the team, you're going to have people coming to you like left and right with feedback and, criticism, and sometimes good, sometimes bad.
That's a really good observation. I think that point, I want to point out something with that, which is that when we say shaping, it's just kind of one word and it's not clear what it means. And I actually think that the shaping is the most effective when it's at the back end of the solo part of shaping is at the back end of the shaping process. And there's a front end of the shaping process that is very integrative, in the sense of like you talk to a lot of people, you're getting a lot of inputs. You're kind of vetting the idea to be like, if I actually put my time into shaping this, like, is it going to be something people care about? And am I going to be able to bring it back to them? And they're going to be able to say like, yeah, you know what I mean? And that, I think that's on the shaper, the person who, so the thing is that the shaping has a heads down aspect to it, of like, I have to actually problem solve and come up with a scope that's doable. But then but you don't want to just start with doing the heads down part if you haven't kind of sniffed around the company to figure out what people value and what people think is important, and what people already know, right? Because you want that to kind of, the shaping needs to take all of that stuff into account in order for it to be valuable.
Yeah, for sure. And so in our case, that looks like the solo work part is usually a team lead who understands their business unit with a manager at the beginning, and they do this sort of, so it's definitely not alone. It's usually like somebody else in this early stage, and then it gets surfaced to the entire management team, where more people are actually now able to say, hey, for instance, if something an idea that I have impacts finance in a big way, then I get then we start having those conversations and the collaboration of where things need to go, and so we need to start surfacing our projects or our shaping earlier. But like I said, but we do it in a way where it can't be too early, because if it's too early, sometimes you can actually maybe go in the wrong direction. Like you kind of need to incubate the idea better to present it, right? Like that, so that it's worth for somebody reading it, because you also don't want to surface a pitch that it's lacking so many things that is not going to engage anybody who's reading it.
Yeah, this
right?
is the funny thing about shaping is that there's always sort of these two aspects to it. There's the shaping in terms of the actual work to be done, but then there's also shaping in a way. Shaping is kind of like sales. Like you don't just go offer somebody something or ask them for something. You have to figure out kind of like what's the time and the way and what should be in and what should be out and you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
this, it's a very multi-sided process. I actually suspect that as practitioners, who are all like peers doing this together, the more that we talk with each other, we're going to start to be able this thing that is one word shaping, and we're going to start to be able to have more words for what is that part in the beginning of shaping that's a little bit more directional about, I think these are the things that the other people in the company care about. And what's the part of it that's more integrative in the sense of this is the technical part and this is the design part and this is the business part of it and this is what support is going to think and this is what sales is going to think. And then where's the part that's a little bit more concepting in terms of like here are the key components of the idea that we're actually going to put into software and so on. Like I think there's a lot of aspects to this that we haven't articulated yet that we're kind of learning to talk about together.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's already happening. And since you said practitioners, and I think you know about this, right? There's a meetup with Shaper practitioners
Yeah.
that it's been super interesting to just hear other people who are doing this because we're really the first few people who have done this, right? This has been around for like less than a year officially.
Yeah.
And then on one of them, on one presentation, I remember somebody, I think his name is Johnny Bradshaw. He talked about how ShapeUp is helping the entire company with having a common language. So even though you feel unsatisfied saying because it's basic, right? Like there's like a glossary of like maybe 2 pages, I think, in the book, or
Yeah.
I don't know exactly how many. And you're thinking like eventually we can have like a little, more than that, where like now we're all talking the same language. But even, just to give you some feedback, like it's happening to us too.
That's
You see
awesome.
people who have no idea of how to develop software who are using breadboarding and shaping and fixed time and all these things that are new for everybody, but especially
That's great.
for non-product people. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think that's really helpful too, because I think before um, the only language we had was very, very concrete, too concrete. Like, where's the wireframe? What's the mock-up? Like, what's the estimate? And as we start to talk a little bit more about like the shaping and the pitch and the constraints and stuff like that, I think it allows more people to be involved in the fact that we're trying to that there are these earlier phases of figuring out what it is, right? And then it allows us all to collaborate more toward guiding it to become the right thing instead of just somebody asks for something and then some designer gives you back a mock-up and then some programmer codes something. And there's this like big gap in between of like, wait a minute, how it seemed like too hard to talk about. Like,
Yeah.
how did we get here? Exactly. Yeah, totally. That's great to hear.
Yeah.
So I just want maybe it's about time for us to wrap up here. Anything else from your side that was important that we didn't get to?
No, I mean, like I said to you, like the way I looked at this feedback was also, chronologically, like our issues that we had in terms of, pre-cycle, some things that we had, within the cycle, something, and then some issues that we've had, post-cycle, which is cool down. Not honestly, nothing too huge that I want to get into. But I would just say like there's also a section where I said wins, and like I said earlier, it's for us it has been a substantial change. Going from the Ticket Factory to ShapeUp. We're beyond excited to continue using this, not just for a product team, but also for the different teams in the company, because we see the value of it. And we like I said earlier too, with the developer portal, it was the first thing that we shipped that's user facing, and it just brought, I think, morale up so much for the company. And so I just wanted to be able to share that sort of win with everybody, because we're again, for us it's like a before and after. So we're excited to be part of this, and excited to contribute to this
That's awesome.
community in any way we can. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. I'm learning a lot from doing these too. I mean, a big takeaway for me for this session is actually to highlight this difference between like the sequence of the work as one project versus the sequence of the work for individual chunks of the project, and that those chunks themselves have a sequence. I think this is something really fundamental, and this idea of hiring the designer for 2 weeks at the beginning of the project versus figuring out how to bring the designer in strategically along the life of the project. I think this is going to be something to talk about more, and I'm really glad that I had the chance to start to dig into it today.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
awesome, cool. Hey Pablo, thanks so much for
Thank you,
joining.
Ryan.
Thanks for being willing to do this.
Of
I think
course.
it's really helpful for all of us. So really enjoy it, and have a good one.
Sounds good, you too. Thanks again.
All right, take